Welcome. Today, we're zooming in on one specific word in the Quran, Khamr, which you'll often see translated as intoxicants. We're going to dig into what the text actually says about it. And, the arguments that come from a really close reading of the language might just surprise you. So let's just get right to the big question. Is alcohol forbidden in the Quran? Now, for a lot of people, the answer is a simple, straightforward yes. But as we're about to see, when you go directly to the source text itself, a much more detailed and frankly more nuanced picture starts to emerge. And that right there is our focus today. We're going to try to set aside centuries of later interpretation for a moment and look purely at the language inside the Quran. And what this textual deep dive seems to point to is not so much a simple legal ban, but a really powerful underlying principle. Okay, so let's dive into this first key idea. The whole argument really kicks off by looking at the specific words the Quran uses when it talks about intoxicants. And the claim is that it frames the issue as a series of strong warnings, not absolute black and white legal commands. All right, this is one of the foundational verses on the topic. Now just listen to the phrasing here. In them is great harm and benefits, but their harm is greater. See, it's not a command, right? It's more like an evaluation, a weighing of pros and cons that the reader is being asked to think about. So this verse is basically asking you to weigh the consequences. It flat out says there's great harm, but it also acknowledges there's some benefit. But here's the crucial part. The text doesn't use the specific legal term for something being absolutely forbidden, which is harama. Instead, it's all framed as a moral calculation, and that really appeals directly to a person's ability to reason. Okay, so the next key verse kind of shifts the focus. Here, the instruction isn't really about the substance itself. It's about a specific state of being. The word is sukara, or drunk, and it's in the context of prayer or communication. So the text isn't targeting the drink. It's targeting the effect of the drink, that feeling of having a compromised intellect. The problem that's being highlighted is the disruption of your reason, that state of not really knowing what you're saying. And that's a very different focus than just the act of consumption itself. Now, this is probably the strongest verse of discouragement. It calls intoxicants and a few other things tainted by the work of the devil, and it gives an instruction to avoid. But pay close attention to the specific pronoun used here. Avoid him. And just look at the reasons the verse gives for this warning. The justification isn't that the substance is just inherently evil. It's that it leads to these very specific social and mental harms. Enmity, hatred, and distraction from spiritual remembrance. So the focus, once again, is on the negative consequences. And this brings us to a really fascinating grammatical point. That command, fajtanibohu, avoid him, uses a singular pronoun. Grammatically, the argument goes that him refers back to the last singular agent that was mentioned, which was the devil, not the plural list of items. So the instruction is to avoid the corrupting influence, the work of the devil that can taint these things, not necessarily the items themselves. It's a subtle but pretty important distinction. Okay, let's look at the next piece of this puzzle, the word Khamr itself. What does this word actually mean if you trace it back to its roots? So the Arabic root for Khamr is K-M-R, and at its core, this root means to cover, to veil, or to conceal. This root meaning is basically the anchor for this entire linguistic argument that we're about to see. And this table just illustrates the point brilliantly. The Quran uses this same root, Khamr, in different forms. For example, kumur is used to mean a physical covering, like a headscarf. So, following that logic, Khamr, in the context of intoxicants, is interpreted as a mental covering, something that veils or conceals the intellect. So here's the big takeaway from that. If Khamr is defined by its effect, the veiling of the mind, then it isn't necessarily just one specific substance, like alcohol. It's more like a whole category of anything that clouds your reason and impairs your judgment. All right, now let's widen the lens a bit. How does this whole principle-based interpretation, this idea of focusing on protecting the intellect, how does that fit with other themes that we find all throughout the Quran? This is where it gets really interesting, because the Quran actually describes paradise as having rivers of wine, delightful to those who drink it. Now, that seems like a pretty big contradiction if the substance itself is supposed to be inherently forbidden, right? But, and this is a huge but, the text gives us a key distinction. This heavenly wine is explicitly described as being totally free from the negative effects of the earthly stuff. It says there's no distress, no headache, no exhaustion, none of the qualities that veil the intellect. And that pretty much solves the puzzle. By promising a harmless version of wine in paradise, it actually reinforces the argument that the core issue here on earth isn't the substance itself, but its harmful, mind-altering effect. And what's more, this whole discussion fits perfectly within a much broader theme in the Quran, this general principle of moderation and avoiding excess, or israf. And this principle applies to pretty much everything, from how you spend your money to how you eat and drink. So after looking at all this textual evidence, how does it all come together? What's the core principle we're left with? Okay, let's just quickly walk through the argument we've traced through the text. First, the language is all about warning and evaluation, not legal command. Second, the focus is on the state of intoxication, that place where reason is lost. Third, the word Khamr itself means to veil, defining the problem by its effect on the mind. And finally, this all fits neatly within the Quran's bigger, overarching principle of avoiding excess. So, when you put all of those pieces together, the interpretation we've explored today argues that the Quran isn't just banning a specific drink, it's actually establishing this profound, timeless principle: protect your intellect, avoid anything in any quantity that veils your reason and ends up leading to harm. And that leaves us with a final, and I think, pretty provocative question. This whole textual analysis focuses on a core principle, not just a specific rule. And it raises a much bigger question, one that's relevant to a lot of traditions. How do the broad ethical principles that you find in a sacred text become the specific, detailed rules that people actually live by? Now that's a question worth reflecting on. Thanks for digging into this with us today.